Instead found out that my mitral valve had entirely failed. And the reason I had a cough was that blood was going backwards into my lungs. And had I gone home and rested and had a cup of tea like I'd planned, I would have died by that night. So there I was in the emergency room, thinking I was going to get some antibiotics or just be told that, all was well. And I was rushed into open heart surgery that night. So here I was knowing that I hadn't had traditional symptoms. So when I heard of the work that Dr. Tremmel was doing on sex differences in research in cardiology, I was thrilled and I had to meet her. And I just think that this is one of the most important things to be looking at now, because I was really lucky, but we can't rely on luck. We have to look at bringing knowledge to people of what to look for. So with that, I'm going to introduce Jennifer and read this so I make sure to get all of her wonderful qualifications. Dr. Jennifer Tremmel is an interventional cardiologist at Stanford University Hospital. As the co-founder and clinical director of the Women's Heart Health Program, she has a deep commitment to keeping sex differences in the forefront of research and clinical care at Stanford and in the broader field of cardiovascular medicine. Thank you so much. I'm very proud to introduce you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Emily. Part of my job was to say why it was so important that we're here, but I think you just did that very eloquently, so I appreciate that. I wanted to reiterate my thanks to you as being one of our hosts, Bethany Mayer as one of our hosts, and Suzanne Clay as one of our hosts. So we appreciate all of this and putting it together. This gathering coincides with a meeting by the Organization for the Study of Sex Differences, OSSD, and they have an annual meeting every year. And this brings together leading scientists nationally and internationally who look at sex differences and find it very important. They're very passionate about what they do. And this meeting, we were fortunate enough to be able to host at Stanford this year and really appreciate that honor because it brings sex differences here and hopefully also highlights some of the work that we're doing at Stanford as well. And I want to particularly thank, again, Suzanne Clay and her husband Jay for being large sponsors of making this program possible here at Stanford. It's very important to us. So I think we all have, I have a minute left. This is going to be a tough time for us to keep, so we have a lot of important things to cover. I think we all have a good sense, hopefully from this story, of why studying sex differences is so important, at least in cardiovascular disease, and I would say across the board. Data has really been primarily in men, and data is what drives how we care for patients. And so if we learn something in a study, but it's only about men, and then we apply it to our female patients, does it actually work? And do you want to be a guinea pig in finding out if this works or not? And sometimes this goes the other way as well. So when we study sex differences, we learn about men too. So the study of sex differences is important in both directions to make sure that we're bringing ultimately personalized care to everyone and making sure that we're getting treated the best that we can. So briefly, the Women's Heart Health Program that we have here was started in 2007. The program has grown tremendously. Some of my colleagues are here: Sandra Tsai, a preventive cardiologist; Marina Judley, our nurse practitioner. We have a non-invasive cardiologist. We have a psychologist, which was made possible by philanthropic funds as well. You don't always get to have a psychologist in a cardiology clinic, but that's turned out to be very important. We also collaborate with an electrophysiologist and a vascular surgeon and really try to take care of the full woman in terms of cardiovascular health. The other thing that's very important to me, as was mentioned, is promoting sex differences across cardiovascular medicine. And so we're doing a lot of great cardiovascular research at Stanford. It's very well known for its cardiovascular research. But one of the questions is, how can we get our investigators to think about sex differences? And so again, philanthropic funds have been very important in terms of seed grants and getting investigators who maybe wouldn't have thought about how are my female rats versus my male rats doing in regards to this this study that I'm looking at, and giving them actually support to do that, because you can't simply do that without having funds to do it. So I'm appreciative of that as well. So I want to introduce our panel, and this is the highlight of this evening, because this is a very distinguished panel, and a panel that really crosses the spectrum of doing research and clinical care, and looking at all the places that sex differences comes up, and all the people that it's important to be thinking about this to actually make this work, so that ultimately our healthcare focuses on sex differences. So I'm going to start with Dr. Sean Liu, and I'm going to make sure I get my notes right as well, but I know Sean, so he's a cardiologist here. He's also a basic scientist, and a distinguished one as well. So he got the NIH Director's Pioneer Award in 2014, and that supports innovative research. And then he was also one of the recipients of our seed grant, and the seed grants were made possible by Connie Lurie, as mentioned. And so he's going to be looking at myositis, which is actually something that, or myocarditis, that affects males more than females, and actually trying to figure out how can we look at what's advantageous about the females to ultimately help the males. So an interesting take on how you might do sex differences. And then we have Dr. Marcia Stefanik, and she's been a longtime friend. She's a professor in the Stanford Prevention Research Center, and she does population science. And Marcia has really been a pioneer of sex differences in women's health, I think probably since you started doing this. A huge advocate. She was involved in the big hormone trials, the WHI, and that sort of thing, and has really had a vision of how do we promote sex differences across all disciplines, and not just cardiovascular medicine. And with that vision was able to start the Wisdom Center, which is the Women and Sex Differences in Medicine, and really is promoting sex differences across everyone on campus, also gender issues as well. And this is very important, right? We need to be looking everywhere at this. Marcia's also a co-host this year, and so the Wisdom Center helped host the OSSD meeting as well, and so I'm pleased to be a co-host with her. And then we're not in the right order, so I'm gonna rearrange you guys. Can you two switch places? Yeah, Ken just wanted to sit next to you. So, it'll just screw me up if we're all in the wrong row. So, Dr. Ken Mahaffey, a cardiologist and a clinical scientist, and he's director of the Stanford Center for Clinical Research. And he basically now, I guess, has a job at Stanford of finding and implementing improved methods for clinical and translational research, and then ultimately taking those into clinical practice. So a big task comes from Duke, where he worked with their big research institute, large data, and also doing big clinical trials. So comes with a lot of experience to Stanford. Dr. Vera Regic-Zagrozik. I told her I was going to blow it. I was practicing all afternoon. We'll call her Vera. And Vera's wonderful. So Vera gives us a real international perspective. So she comes from Berlin, Germany. She is a leading cardiologist, particularly from a female perspective. So she's someone we all look up to as women in cardiology. She's also internationally recognized for her research. And she is the director of the Institute of Gender and Medicine at the Center for Cardiovascular Research at Charité University, and she's also president of the International Society for Gender and Medicine. An easier name, Dr. Art Arnold, is a sex differences scientist in the field of neuroscience. He is a distinguished professor of integrated biology and physiology at the UCLA hospital, and also director of the UCLA Laboratory in Neuroendocrinology. And he's been very involved in OSSD for many years, was secretary for some time, and now is editor-in-chief of the Society's journal, which is the Biology of Sex Differences. And then finally we have Dr. Janine Clayton, and she comes to us from the NIH, and you're an ophthalmologist, right, by training, and she's the director of the NIH Office of Research in Women's Health. And she's leading a policy change initiative that has come about, which is going to require in some way scientists to include female animals and cells in their preclinical research design, which is very important. So this is our distinguished panel, and it really, like I said, kind of goes across the spectrum. We have the lowly, investigator, all the way to the NIH, that's really setting policy and holds the money for us to do our research. And so we want to give you kind of a cross-section of this. So let's start with Dr. Wu and tell us a little bit about kind of sex differences within basic science, and how does one actually end up doing that, and what's needed to promote that, and with scientists that actually don't necessarily think about sex differences.
Yeah, sure, great. Thanks a lot, Jennifer. So what I'll do probably just kind of take you through just very brief history of how I came about, eventually ending up here at Stanford and the research that we do. So, early on in my years, I was looking into stem cell biology and cardiac development. So I was over at Boston Children's Hospital where, the earlier work that we had looked at in terms of heart formation and heart development, and that was to relate to how to understand congenital heart disease in children. So when I was early studying that, what was interesting to me, because the model for studying it was either using mice or at the time we were actually using mouse embryonic stem cell to mimic the development. And what was curious to me was actually that almost all of the lines of the stem cell we were studying was entirely male lines. So it was a little curious to me, like, well, why is it then, when you can make stem cell from male or female, that people almost exclusively study lines who are male? So that was sort of the initial. Now the question might be, there are a lot of reasons actually in the end, why is it that people are using male-female stem cell? Mostly biological thing, but what did pique my interest from that was the fact that, there are really a lot of questions in the differences between male and female that we really haven't explored very well in the basic biology. So one example is we had a genetic model where both patients who are lost of a gene function end up having heart failure because of the loss of this gene, and the effect of this is predominantly actually in the male mice, and we don't see that in females. So what was interesting is there has to be some protective factor that's present in female, which would be extremely valuable to find, that would both help the male population, but also understanding the biology of female. Again, there's no support that has been given for that. So we're really grateful for the Women's Heart Health to be able to now look at some of the diseases, or in this case would be the viral responses of having an infection to the heart, which is one of the most common in children, and they develop heart failure, needing transplants. And we're really glad to now be able to explore this in the differences, between, the males that are getting infected with the virus, and looking at how that compared with female who, get the same virus, and how those different responses might help us understand, these immune response to, children who are, dealing with these viral infection and developing heart disease. So yeah, we're really grateful, and grateful to all of you to support the work that we have. Thank you.
So that's great. I'm going to try to resist asking further questions because I have lots of questions, but I also wanted to remind people that we are going to have time for Q&A, and so if you think of questions, make sure you write them down, because we would like to have a discussion when we get through our panel. So Dr. Stefanik, so you have been a great promoter of sex differences across all disciplines. So, tell us kind of how does cardiovascular medicine fit into that, and how does one pursue kind of getting all investigators interested in this?
Well, I think I'll start also with a little history. So my graduate work was actually in reproductive physiology and neuroendocrinology, and I was doing a lot of animal work. Some of the leading people in this field are in this room, so you should know you have sex difference experts that are like phenomenal in this room. But I really couldn't continue doing animal work. I really felt that for me I needed to do human work. And so I decided to move into cardiovascular, and with my hormone background, I really wanted to study hormones and heart disease. which at that time was the leading message for women, that we should take menopausal hormones to prevent heart disease, and we did the Women's Health Initiative. But my interest in hormones and sex differences just kept coming back, and so I just couldn't put that down. And over time with women's health, where so much of gender and sex differences is part of women's health, it was just a natural that we would go to the dean. The dean actually, Dean Pizzo, did a strategic plan for us to create the Women and Sex Differences, the Wisdom Center in medicine, so the Sex Differences in Medicine Center. And we got some seed funding so that we could really look at a broad range of different areas for sex differences, from neuroscience, bone, heart. We actually also have some seed grants for cardiovascular, which is still a very strong part of my essence. I actually have a big study now on physical activity and heart disease, and heart disease that's going to be important. But my goal, one of the goals in our strategic plan, was to get OSSD here at Stanford to really shine the light on Stanford as a potential for doing sex difference research, and to really let Stanford see what's out there. And I have to tell you, the last 2 days have been so exciting, and just feeling like this is happening, and we are definitely going to, I think, help lead the show. I mean, we've got the leaders here, but Stanford has a huge potential. We do a lot of education and research seminars. We do basic and translational research symposium on sex differences every year, a different theme. Next year we'll do cardiovascular again. This year we did cancer, last year immunology, the year before that neuroscience. So the interdisciplinary focus really speaks to my physiology roots.
That's great. So, Dr. McCaffrey, so Dr. Stefano just said Stanford has huge potential. So you're at the helm of the research here at Stanford in terms of directing things. So how does an academic center kind of drive research?
Yeah, I think the academic environment needs to be driving the research in partnership with our government agencies that sponsor research, NIH, but also with industry. Who has a keen interest in understanding the safety and efficacy of drugs and devices in both men and women. And I'll tell a little story as well. I'm a cardiologist, as Jennifer said, and I've had the great fortune over the last 20 years of running very large cardiovascular outcome trials, typically trials of 10 to 20,000 patients. And I remember when I unblinded and we got the results of our first large clinical trial, I looked at the results and I said, wow, there's more women dying of heart disease every day than men in the United States, but only 30% of the patients or subjects in our clinical trials were women. A tragedy. So every time I stood up there, I said, women are underrepresented. And I asked some of my mentors, well, why is this? And this is 20 years ago, and they said, look around the room to who you're presenting to. Cardiology, unfortunately at that time, was a very male and white male dominated profession. But we're seeing great heterogeneity now. And I always wondered whether or not part of who was taking care of these patients was driving the inclusion or lack of inclusion of women in these studies. But unfortunately, what we found over the years is the proportion of women as subjects in clinical trials has not gone up dramatically. So it really compromises often our ability to understand the inferences from the trial results when the proportion of women is relatively modest. It's still only 30 to 35%. Why is that? Unfortunately, there's not a lot of funding or research going into answering those specific questions. Why do certain people volunteer to participate in studies? I think there's probably some sex and gender issues, but there's a lot of other issues. So I'm right now, as we're promoting clinical research on campus here, to really complement the incredible history in the basic sciences and discovery, we're really trying to think about how to do trials better, and more importantly, how we can do trials that will incorporate real-world populations, including more women, so that we understand the results, and the results that we see are applicable to our entire society. So looking forward to collaborating with many people here on campus since I've only been here for about a year, and appreciate all the support that you're showing by being here tonight and in other venues. Thanks.
Fantastic. Vera. So in Europe, how are things going compared to the U.S. In terms of sex differences? Is Europe ahead of us, behind us? And is anything we have to learn from Europe?
Okay, thank you for this. Thank you very much for this opportunity here. I'm a clinical cardiologist by training, and I made a very similar experience as it was just described. So being a clinical cardiologist, I got the opportunity about 12 years ago to build an institute for gender medicine. And this is continuously growing, and I think this is growing because we are working at 3 different levels. First, we are really addressing our students, because we believe that the next generation of doctors do need a better training in gender medicine. I met Marcia about 5 years ago on this topic, and I met Londa, who is a very nice collaborator, and now Jennifer in Stanford. We have a program where we have entered training on sex and gender differences into all medical fields at our university. And I think this is very important. So the students are now learning from the beginning that women and men may be different. And then I'm also working at the EU Commission, for the EU Commission, and we are doing big studies to assess in the EU the awareness. How big is the awareness in the general population? For example, among you are not general population, but if you go out, do people know that women and men may be different? So and do doctors know? So we are doing these awareness studies. And these are 2 important pillars. And in addition, we are doing a lot of basic research because we believe that the knowledge from basic research must fit into these programs. So knowledge generation is important, but dissemination of knowledge and awareness in the population and knowledge of our doctors and students is as important as well. And therefore we are working on such a broad level.
Thank you. So, Dr. Arnold, so you're in an interesting position because you're an editor of a journal, and so when research is done, then it's submitted to a journal, and there's a peer review, and the editor looks at the paper as well and decides if it's in or out. And so editors hang out together and talk to each other, right? And there's been some mumblings about, do we need to have sex differences or not? And so I'm curious, where do editors stand on this? Obviously, your journal is about sex differences, so you're going to have a different kind of view. But in general, what are we seeing with editors? Because they actually play a role in what gets out to clinicians in terms of how to take care of patients.
So first of all, I want to say that I'm really delighted to be here back at Stanford. My daughter did her PhD here. We feel in our family very close affiliation to Stanford, even though we play your women's basketball team every year for UCLA, and get beat by Stanford every year. But anyway, I'm delighted to be back. This is really a special occasion. This Stanford team saw the attraction of bringing this international congress, which is truly an exciting experience. We're pushing an agenda here, which is that women and females are understudied at NIH. We don't have the information about how they are the same or different from males. And we're finding out that there are all sorts of differences in cardiovascular disease, kidney disease, cancer, obesity, metabolic disease. It's throughout the body. And we're pushing this agenda with a cooperative team across the universities, and you're seeing it here. You're seeing individual investigators, you're seeing heads of departments, you're seeing our hero at NIH, who you haven't heard from yet, Dr. Clayton, who is pushing the agenda of fostering the inclusion of females in the comparison to males, so if there's a disease and the males get the disease more than the females, it means that the females are protected. And females have something special that if we could give that to the men and the women, we might be able to treat the disease better. So on the publishing, and there's been this understudy of women has been pervasive. so that there are many papers published in biomedical science where you can't actually tell whether they studied males or females because they didn't happen to mention it. Right? It's thought to be that important by some journals and editors. So the OSSD, the Organization for the Study of Sex Differences, is founded to push this agenda of the critical importance of comparing the sexes. And we've founded a new journal, the Biology of Sex Differences, which I'm privileged to edit, where in fact sex differences are front and center. And absolutely every article we publish, you know exactly whether it's a male cell or a female cell. And it does go to the cellular level. Every cell has a sex. So I'm truly delighted. I have been to Stanford before on the invitation of Drs. Stefanik and Tremmel. They are doing a terrific job here. Stanford has all of the tools to solve this problem. Okay? The tools are there, the techniques are here, and it is a problem that should be solved at Stanford and in all the other major medical, biomedical research centers around the world, really. So hats off to Stanford, and I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
Dr. Clayton, so I think everyone probably starts with where's all the funding going, right? So the NIH, drives the ability of researchers to do research, right? And so when funding goes down, it's difficult for scientists. And so I think that's one big thing. But the NIH is very powerful, right? So it can kind of dictate how research is going to be done, because ultimately investigators need to present studies to the NIH that the NIH feels are important and will improve the health of our nation. And so how is the NIH really fostering that to improve the health of our nation?
So again, really, really delighted to be here and amongst this distinguished panel. What we do at NIH is really straightforward, from turning discovery into health. That's what we do, that's our mission. We're funded by every single taxpayer, and that's our mission. In order to do our mission, translate discovery into health, we have to absolutely do that for men and women. We absolutely must study both sexes. And so I've been privileged as the director of the Office of Research on Women's Health to bring attention to the issue and the fact that we weren't looking at both sexes. We weren't, as Dr. Arnold mentioned, studying females as much as we were studying males. So we need to understand both female and male biology at a preclinical level. That research that we do that explores and identifies targets for therapies or studies models of human disease, we have to understand if it's similar or different, and if those treatments might work for both men and women, or if the side effects might be different for males or females. And so I'm really excited to be able to take on some of these issues. Many of the folks here and the folks at the OSSD meeting have been doing this for many years and have been pushing and identifying the data, the evidence upon which we can make these recommendations and these decisions. And from my perspective, institute policy changes that will ensure that everyone, every investigator who seeks NIH funding, publicly funded research, that it addresses sex, being male or female, and whether that's similar or different in that preclinical research as well as in that clinical research. So it's really a privilege and an honor to be able to do that work, build upon the incredible legacy of many people here. But as a clinician, the reason why it's so important to me as a physician is it is really challenging to sit in front of a patient, and all of us have been on that side of being a patient, every single one of us here, and not have evidence upon which to make a treatment decision. It's horrible to be able to have to say to a patient, I don't know if this medication is going to work for you as well as it does for a man, as well as it does for a young person. That is a position that none of us should be in as clinicians or as patients. So we really have a lot of work to do to continue to develop that evidence, our understanding about male and female biology, so that every single patient, all of us, when we are sitting there, our grandmothers, our granddaughters, our sisters, our brothers, our husbands, get the treatment that's right for them at the right time. So that's what I'm privileged to be able to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you. We're very happy about what you're doing. Keep up the good work. So we're going to open it up to questions. I saw someone already ready. Yeah, great. So let's start with some questions.
Thank you so very much. I'm wondering if you could tell us where the FDA is now on approving clinical trials and the population that's being studied in those trials. Is there a requirement for women?
So the question is about the FDA and the populations. It's a very good question. For the NIH, so the federally funded from NIH clinical trials, women and minorities, in fact, must be included in NIH-supported clinical research, unless there's a scientifically valid reason for that not to be the case. FDA research is regulated separately, and there are requirements based on FDA regulations which are distinct from NIH. The population that the drug will be used in should be included, but there isn't a mandate for FDA trials. For NIH trials, they're over 50% of the participants in aggregate are women for NIH-supported trials. But for many of the trials that are for drugs that we all take, those come through the FDA, and there are different rules there.
Other questions?
Are there any other?
What other disease areas are we making real progress in terms of studying sex differences?
Dr. Stefanik, do you want to take that one?
Well, I'm actually going to say that we're becoming aware of the need to get the drugs right, so I'm going to just follow up because drugs are in my mind. Recently, I think many of you know that Zolpidem was given a female-specific dose because women were waking up they still were sleepy, it's a sleep medication, and they were getting in accidents, and no one had ever really thought through the fact that we're giving these drugs as if one size fits all, and we're all smaller than men, but also we metabolize drugs differently. The pharmacodynamics and kinetics of the liver are very different. So there's a lot of other diseases, and I could go through a long list. I actually teach a class on sex and gender and human physiology and disease, and every area has a disease. But I think for us, what's really important now is that people finally realize that we need to be treated differently, and that we need to start to look at what are these sex differences in metabolism and drugs. So I'll answer it with that.
Yes.
I'll add a comment to that unless there's other questions. It fits in nicely with the question about the FDA as well, because as I mentioned in my opening comments, when you have a very modest proportion of the subjects in a clinical trial that fall into a specific subgroup, such as women, the inferences that you can make from the observations in that small subgroup can be challenging. And so the FDA, in some recent deliberations in my field of research, was these blood thinners, anticoagulants, and antiplatelet agents, where there's actually been examples where when you look at subgroups, including women, there is no benefit if you just look at the overall results in that subgroup. But we don't know if it's just a chance finding because it's a small subgroup, and it actually benefits women if you studied enough, or as Marcia just nicely pointed out, is there maybe a problem with the subtleties in the dosing that were used that maybe a little less or maybe a little more may have helped the women? We don't know that, and that's why we need to work on clinical trial designs that'll really address those issues, and enrolling more patients in general and more women specifically would help that.
So I have a question across our panel. If I want each one of you to think of, if you had to pick the most important thing to get scientists to start doing sex differences research, what would that be? And since you all have a different perspective, we might have some different answers. We'll start with Dr. Wood.
Yeah, so actually, before I answer that question, I actually want to just add one thing which was related to the topic Marcia and also Ken had mentioned. A much more practical example is on my other hat as a clinical cardiologist and just having clinic this morning, was having actually exactly the same discussion, because one of my patients who was taking a beta blocker, a medicine for heart disease, couldn't tolerate it because the smallest amount of dose that was actually available was still too much for her. And, you know, it addresses an issue, I think, because when the pharmaceutical company doesn't think about what dose ranges that are appropriate for people in different size range, they're not even going to make the drugs that's available that fits with what people need. So I think bringing awareness to what the appropriate ranges of drug dosing that you need for women and men, I think it's going to really, you know, help a lot, especially when you have someone like that who, you know, basically is now out of a really good drug just because the company doesn't think about how to dose it right. Now, back to this question. So what is the most important thing to try to get a basic scientist to actually think about? Well, I can tell you in the minds of every basic scientist is, how do I get my research funded by the government, by foundation? So if the issue comes up where they are not going to get their grant supported because they are not thinking about differences in the male and the female population of either animals or cells that they're studying, and they are being deemed and fail from receiving funding because they're not addressing the issue, then I guarantee you every grant will come with sex differences as part of the work that they'll study.
So I'm going to follow up with a similar, instead of a specific disease, because I think it depends on which one you get, which is the most important one to you. I think precision health is kind of our new mantra at Stanford, and that when we look at sex differences, most of us do relate to being male or female. I do have lots of students now that fall in between, and I'm very respectful of that, and I feel that we need to be there for that group. But precision health really is understanding how every tissue, every organ, every cell differs. That's basic science. When we talk about basic science, our basic science is wrong. Stanford should do better than that. I feel like this is such an important thing for just beyond just the translation to disease. So I'm not a clinician, and I know that it would be really hard to be across the table from each individual person, but if we got the basic science right, we could help the population, which is kind of where my emphasis goes.
Quick answer to the most important thing we need.
Yeah, so from a clinical trialist perspective, I think we need to understand a couple of things. One is how we get, as I've already said, sounding like a broken record, but how we get more women in these large cardiovascular outcome trials, which now spans multiple disease states. And why that is happening needs to be further understood. The second area is that a lot of the things that we do to try and understand what patients' perspectives are about their therapies and their expectations for their outcome is also driven a lot by male preferences. And so I think we need to understand more about what drives people's insights and expectations about their medical care. Not just in terms of sex differences, but economic differences and other things that define how we look and make decisions about our health care.
So true scientists, Ken said we need more data to answer your question. So any other comments on what would be most helpful? Yes?
I just say double the NIH budget.
Okay, so funding again, huh?
Something simple. Now, the NIH has lost, I believe, 25% of its buying power in the last decade. This is serious. This is totally serious. We have people that's meeting superb scientists. One guy came up to me and said that he's dying. Like he cannot renew his grants. I know his science to be really spectacular. He's studying, in his case, the effect of the Y chromosome, what makes a male different from a female. That's a sex difference. And that actually does help us understand females to know what the Y chromosome is doing. There's a way to understand that. But his grants are not competing in this enormously competitive environment. So our Congress currently can't agree on much of anything. But I hope there would be bipartisan support eventually to return at least what we've lost, which is it has been huge. Because that will certainly buoy the research to include women and females.
Dr. Clayton, I know you're not going to say funding.
Dr. Arnold mentioned this issue, and it's something that is really, really concerning to NIH, and the fact that investigators, male and female investigators, especially mid-stage investigators, are leaving research. These are brilliant people with brilliant ideas. They have the study design. They're leaving research. They're spending their intellectual energy on something else because they can't get funded. So, we all need that to be able to do what we're trying to do. But in response to your question, Jennifer, I think if we all recognize that sex is important in understanding whether males or females are different or similar, and we all do our part, every single response you heard from, as well as our partners in industry, all do our part in our sphere to advance this understanding, I think we can move some things forward.
Other questions from our audience?
I do have a question. If we talk about the promise of stem cells and the potential of stem cell to harness the energy of stem cell to alter what's happening for heart repair or heart health, and if sex then is cellular, how do those two universes of stem cell regeneration and treatment affect women versus men? I mean, is the stem cell arena even looking at stem cell at sex differences?
Yeah, so I take it it's a question that, directed towards me since I brought up the word stem cells. So, well, I would say actually first, this building itself actually is the Stem Cell Institute building, for Stanford University. And there has been tremendous support actually both from state and also from the, donors that actually have supported this building. To come into existence. And so the research work with stem cell and regenerative medicine that we do really is trying to address some of the worst diseases, both genetic and also environmental, that has affected people. But the issue that I brought up about how the issue of sex does not really at all play into the consciousness, including the California State, the Regenerative Medicine Institute, that from the $3 billion bond funding that has gone into helping to support. None of the grant mechanism process even mentions the word sex difference in the research that they're supporting. I mean, I think that really goes into this issue of it has not been brought into the awareness of people, in the state, certainly about what people need to think about stem cell. And then what I said originally about how most of the stem cell people study are male stem cells, because there are different features related to male stem cell that has made it easier for people to study them. There's going to be a huge disadvantage when, the stem cell that gets developed is all related to what a male stem cell and the male application with the male stem cell used for, and there's going to be significant disadvantage, I think, down the road for us not really knowing very much about stem cell biology, which is where a lot of the research interest and momentum and eventually regenerative therapy is going to be going into. So, I mean, I'm really glad that this issue is now really coming into the forefront and coming all the way down to us, the basic sciences people, to really start thinking about the issue. And, I definitely hope that the effort from this conference is really going to, make awareness for all of us to do that, in our research. So, thank you.
And if I could say something, on Londa Shibian's Gender Innovations website, which is an amazing website that's trying to figure out how do we also add gender into this discussion, because a lot of things that happen relate more to our gender roles than just our biology. But in there, she has a very excellent case report of stem cells, where what we've done is we've actually looked at the effect of putting female stem cells into males and males into females. Transplants are great cases where there's so much evidence that you're better off really getting the organ from the same sex versus the other sex, and that it relates somewhat to the stem cells and the fact that hormones actually epigenetically change the way these stem cells function. So it's, again, it's the basic science. It's absolutely crucial that we understand how regenerative medicine is going to play out when we start to try and put this male stem cell. And I think in general, certain areas, female stem cells actually do regenerate better than male stem cells, and probably the other way around. But we need to know when that is, and I think that that's it's really important.
I do want to mention that there are multiple mechanisms where NIH does fund research related to sex differences, but we of course need more. We are supporting centers, specialized centers on sex differences research, which out of the Office of Research on Women's Health. And we also added $10 million to give additional supplemental funds to investigators to add sex differences research. But really, we need much more work in every single area of basic science, and stem cell research is one of the newer areas. Of course, we need attention to those issues as well.
Yeah, so this is, this panel, these are all kind of warriors out there promoting this, and we have people in the audience who for years have been promoting this, and it's very important to get this word out. It's not just scientists either, it's clinicians. Unfortunately, I see a lot of patients who come in and say, well, my doctor said there was no sex difference, no difference between women and men, and that's why I'm here in your office now, because they knew better. And so this trickles throughout medicine. And some of it's if we're not studying it, then we're not thinking about it. And even though the studies will sometimes get out, then the clinicians aren't necessarily reading it because they think, well, there's probably not much to know here. So we actually have a lot of work to do. This is going to, take decades to ultimately get everybody thinking correctly. But I think we're really on the right path. I think we're on a powerful path. There are people, again, across all spectrums of research and medicine promoting this. We're doing it nationally, we're doing it internationally. So I think we're definitely on the right path. And hopefully this will help, again, with our own care as women and men. So I am going to close the panel. I appreciate all of you being here and sharing all your expertise. It's been very interesting. And we're going to have Bethany Mayer come up and have some closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you to the distinguished panel and also to Dr. Trimmel. It was very interesting. I am one of the general public, I would say, and so it was very enlightening to me. And I just want to say thank you to all of you for attending this evening. I have to say, from a personal perspective, I'm here because of an incident that occurred for me, and frankly, the only person who really knew what was going on with my heart was Dr. Trimmel. And the reason for that was because she had studied, there was research that she had done specifically around differences in women from a heart condition perspective, and I have one of those heart conditions that tends to be common in women. So I'm very thankful for her because having been diagnosed correctly and managed with medication appropriately, I get to go on with my life and enjoy the things I do. So I would just like to ask everyone in the audience to please consider being involved in this area of research and the awareness that needs to go out into the community. It is something that continues to be very critical to a very large portion of the population. And it also is critical in the science community and research in all aspects of both illness and education. So thank you all for being here. Thank you, Dr. Trimmel, for doing the wonderful things you do, and also for the panel for helping us understand the differences between the sexes and the research that you do in this area. It is absolutely delightful to be here and just to know that you're there doing this wonderful work on our behalf. So thank you all very much.